So, well, first of all, thank you all for coming. I mean, Lord knows Gaza is not necessarily the sort of sexiest war at this point because we have so many others in the region. I feel like a washing machine myself. But anyway, here we are today. Let's talk about this. So, we may never know the full intentions behind the Hamas October 7 operation. But if one of the goals of its architects was to sabotage the move towards normalization in the region, it's fair to say they've succeeded. It's been a year and 2 months since this war began. That's 14 months of a war that seems limitless in its cruelty, beamed to our screens every day. A war that has killed thousands in Lebanon, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands in Gaza, that has obliterated entire villages, towns, and cities. A war where Arabs and Arab populations feel angrier and more helpless than ever before. And with whom are they angry? It goes well beyond Israel. If you consider the billions of dollars pumped in by the US and the years of effort to improve the US's image in the region, now we're seeing, and this is based on Arab Barometer research, that the percentage of people who perceive the US in a less positive light has increased almost across the entire Arab world. In Tunisia, it's quartered down to 10%. In Jordan, it's almost half to 28%, about on par with Iran. In Iraq, Iran is actually more popular. Meanwhile, US competitors like Russia and China, well, especially China, are actually more popular across the board now. At the same time, there's anger at the West in general, be it governments or institutions that lecture Arabs and Arab states about human rights and international law, and yet have proven to be impotent in the face of a conflict for which many don't even use the right terms, let alone try to stop. Surveys, again, from the Arab Barometer tell us that trust in institutions such as the UN has fallen, and it makes sense because the message since October 7 has been clear. In the realm of international rights and regulations, Arabs are second class. Now, at the same time, it's harder for us to gauge how Arab citizens feel about their leaders, and it's obvious why I'm not going to mention it here. But the fact of the matter is, look at Jordan. You've had a sustained wave of protests demanding the government reverse a decades old peace treaty and sever all economic ties. In Egypt, we've seen people enraged at the sight of an Israeli warship crossing the Suez. Even in the UAE, an enthusiastic and founding member of the Abraham Accords, there is now greater sensitivity about the notion of Emirati firms working with Israeli companies. Now, that may not sound like much, and the much vaunted Arab street has often proven itself to be surprisingly nonchalant about events we thought would be seismic, until it wasn't. The Arab Spring and what is happening now in Syria show us that leaders, no matter how authoritarian, can ignore their citizens only for so long. And the fact of the matter is that October 7th has widened the chasm between governments and people in a way that will affect and is already indeed affecting the domestic stability of America's Arab allies. And then, of course, there's Israel. Now, I mean, regardless of government diktats, the fact of the matter is that the appetite for normalization in the region seems quite low. And even in countries where normalization has happened, approval of those relations is at its nadir. And again, I'm going to call upon the Arab Barometer information here. In Jordan, unsurprisingly, it's about 3%. But even in Morocco, it's at most 13%. Leaders ignore these numbers at their peril, which is perhaps one reason why Saudi Arabia conditioned its normalization deals on something the Abraham Accords never did, namely a viable path towards a Palestinian state. On a more personal level, I've spoken to Arabs in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, elsewhere. And the feeling is that far from being interested in normalization, many feel the only path is war. Why? Because they feel they can no longer countenance living side by side with a neighbor that seems intent on killing its way to peace. Now, this panel here is going to talk about the shifting opinions about the situation in the region based, well, after the October 7 Gaza war. At the same time, we're going to talk about how permanent those changes are, right, and their implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I'm going to start with a question that perhaps is a bit more controversial. Hi, guys. How are you? Sorry. Hi, folks. We can't say guys anymore. Hi, folks. Here's our plan, right? I'm going to start with this question. Does normalization actually matter? I mean, if you consider what's been happening in Egypt and Jordan, I mean, those are two countries that normalized decades ago. But I'll be honest with you, I don't see Egyptians and Jordanians any closer to warm relations with Israelis than before. So let's start with that. Now, I've been instructed that I should sort of begin with, you know, with the doctors, and while Nadim and Tariq give us more sort of meta commentary. So I will start with the doctors. Dr. Amani, You have it. Oh, actually, should I introduce you first? I'm going to do that first. Sorry, this is a bit, it's off the cuff today. So, Dr. Michael Robbins with the Arab Barometer, Nadim Houry. Who are you with these days? Remind me. The Arab Reform Initiative. Dr. Amani with Princeton, and Dr. Tariq. Let's begin. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that. So to jump, it's first of all, it's a great honor and privilege to be here. So thank you. Thank you to the organizers for organizing the panel, and Middle East Council for organizing the panel and hosting us. Um, in general, like if you think about the path towards normalization, what was at least happening in terms of developments in the region about 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, was that most Arab countries were moving towards some sort of normalization with Israel. Um, with the understanding, or maybe without, but by and large, with the understanding that there should be some sort of permanent settlement on the Palestinian side of the equation, right? There was a lot of trepidation and hesitation and frustration on the Arab street that maybe Arab countries would move forward on normalization without resolving the Palestinian issue. And to your point, this is where we've always seen sort of a divergence between what regimes want and where public opinion is. So you're right on target. Even though Egypt and Jordan have normalized with Israel in terms of bilateral peace treaties, the sentiment towards peace or towards Israel, both in Egypt and Jordan, remains quite negative, and even more so today with everything that's going on in Gaza. So the idea has been, at least when we've broken it down in the Arab Barometer, what we find is that um, when you sort of link in support for a independent Palestinian state, there's far more likelihood of citizens to be more supportive of Israel's right to exist and of Israel more generally. But absent that, right? Absent that, support then depletes. So this idea that's been floating around, or this idea that normalization can continue to happen sort of by leaping over the Palestinian issue or bypassing the Palestinian issue, does not track well with Arab publics. We sort of saw some of this here, right, in Qatar during the World Cup match, right? For the longest time, at least even in discourse, or discourse that I was involved in, even like in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, people would say, you know, the Arab world is ready to move on. The Arab world is really tired of the Palestinian issue. It's held back the Arab world. It's held back what's possible. There could be normalization between all the Arab countries and Israel. The Palestinian issue is just a thorn in people's side. And there was this discourse almost that let's just try to forget about the Palestinian issue. And the first reminder in terms of public sentiment, in my opinion, that no, the world has not forgotten about Palestine, especially after the pandemic, is what we saw here during the soccer match, the World Cup soccer match. It could have been any game, and the crowds here in Qatar would start celebrating and singing and chanting for Palestine. This was a reminder. And then, of course, now with Gaza, we know that Palestine has never been more salient in terms of the public opinion of citizens in the region.
Please, Dr. Michael, go ahead.
To echo some what Dr. Many said, what we've really found in Arab Barometer is this challenge with normalization. Is that it's never been particularly well supported, but there are conditions for this. And so in Sudan and Morocco, after there was normalization that took place, the process there, we actually saw a higher percentage of people saying that they were for this. But what was this really meaning? It was that the more educated people in both these countries were actually somewhat more supportive. We saw somewhere about 30 to 40% saying that yes, this was a good deal. But what this really was about what was a good deal for the country. The U.S. recognition of Western Sahara, and then in Sudan being taken off the state spot list.
Right, I was going to say that Morocco and Sudan specifically are specific cases because they got a particularly good suite from the Americans.
Exactly. So, I mean, what they really were agreeing to was essentially this is a good deal for their country. And as soon as we see the Gaza war break out, in Morocco, this falls from 31% to 13%, basically where it was before. So we see the collapse of support for the deal. I think it goes back to what Amani says, is that doing this without the Palestinian issue being resolved, without some type of dignity for the Palestinian people and cause, is really impossible. And what we've found before is in Egypt and Jordan, the two countries you mentioned, there is a very, very low support for really engaging with Israel at this point. It's two of the countries that are most opposed to this. But then we ask this slightly differently, that is it good, is it necessary to coordinate some types of policies with Israel? And these are the places that are actually saying more so that yes, we do need to do that. It's something that can't be ignored, just given the proximity of the two countries. That there is a recognition that Israel exists, but it also isn't something that people want peace with. So it is not going to be a warm peace without some type of broader engagement with the Palestinian cause. I mean, that is essentially part and parcel of any type of normalization. So without that type of process, any type of warm relations is just not possible.
Sure. So does it matter? Does it matter to whom? Because it's true, no one is envisaging today a war and peace with Israel, and frankly, for good reason. There's a genocide being committed, and Netanyahu is a wanted criminal, right? So who wants to make peace with a wanted criminal by the ICC?
Well, but I'll push back on this for 1 minute, which is to say that I would argue it's more a function of the government. Not just Netanyahu at this point. I think we sort of, like reduce the problem to Netanyahu as a scarecrow, but the
Sure.
fact
No, no.
is that there is
Totally
widespread
agree.
consensus.
But he's obviously the symbol, and the 2000 deals that were pushed were really about him. But what worries me, frankly, is the Abraham Accords and the trade deals between Morocco and Israel, between the UAE and Israel, dwarf the trade deals and the trade exchange that exists between Egypt and Jordan despite the years. Just to give you a number from the first 9 months of this year, in the middle of a genocide, $2.43 billion of trade exchange between Israel and the UAE. 2.43 billion, Egypt 430 million. Okay, so it gives you a sense there is something happening, and there are economic exchanges, and who's benefiting from these economic exchanges? We know the biggest export is what? It's not watermelons. It is Israel arms. So Israel Aerospace Industries, and this is not some private Israeli company, this is a state-owned company, actually announced plans to establish a shop in Abu Dhabi to turn Emirates planes into freight planes. Now, this is the same company that is also bombing and committing genocide in Gaza as we speak. So, how do we feel about that? I go further. Morocco, Bluebird companies actually setting up in 2024. They started building a factory to develop so Morocco can produce drones, armed drones, and 50% of this private company is owned by the Israeli government. So on the one hand, you could say, you know what, not a warm peace. On the other hand, I'm seeing it that trade is booming, mostly sale of arms, mostly technology to spy on Arab populations. We saw Pegasus, and God save us from what's coming now that we saw the artificial intelligence that they're using to spy and to target Palestinians in Gaza. So I think we should pause and push back. And really, the difficult question is how do we make it that public opinion, when it's so overwhelmingly important, influence public policies? For me, that's the real question that we should ask ourselves, particularly when we're sitting in the Arab countries. Public opinion should matter. And why does it still not matter?
Go ahead.
I'll pick up on where Nadim has left off, which is to say, why doesn't public opinion matter as much as it should? That's a much broader question, I think, and one that should not sidestep the initial kind of core issue that we started discussing, meaning to answer you would turn this panel into an academic discussion about who formulates policy, who influences policy. Is it ruling elites? Is it the educated class? Is it lobbies? And it's all of that. But just going back to the core question, and I think that is an important starting point for expanding the discussion, and maybe starting off with what you asked. We actually, on October 5th of 2023, had organized a roundtable here in Doha at our institution with an advisor to UNRWA. And at the time, the big challenge facing UNRWA was one of financial resources. They were running out of money. And a lot of Arab countries weren't fulfilling their pledges. Some, in fact, had cut back on their financial commitments. After an hour or so of a discussion about why you need to support UNRWA, a European ambassador asked the question, and I thought it was a very important question at the time. I won't name him. I think I see him in the room today. He goes, can anybody tell us if the Arab world still cares about Palestine and the Palestinians. There was silence in the room, which at least told me and told many other people that, in fact, we were wondering whether the questions still matter, whether people still cared enough, whether public opinion, of course, would come in, governments would step in. Where we are today, relative to where we were just a little over a year ago, is a monumental shift on any level. We've actually gone beyond the Palestinian question now. We're no longer just asking whether we care about the Palestinians committed to their rights, self-determination, whatever it is. We're now asking questions we didn't think we would be asking at the moment. Not only the relationship between the Arab world and Israel, or the Palestinians and their future, we're asking questions about our relationship with the West, our future relationship with the civilization that calls itself the Western world. The return of some of these very hard questions to the table now and how they're driving debate, discussions, and public opinion has profound implications, in my view, moving forward. What the war on Gaza has done is essentially introduce into a discussion about the future of the international system, the so-called rules-based order, against the background of what's happening in Ukraine, accelerated a discussion that is much bigger, much more important, and in my humble opinion, will shape relations between this region and the world, but also how this region behaves, not only vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but vis-a-vis every global question of relevance. Case in point, and I'll stop here, look at what just happened in Baku 2 weeks ago. You averted the collapse of an agreement at the last minute. Why? Because of growing mistrust between what you might call the global south and the global north, between the West and developing countries. The Palestinian question, what's happening in Gaza, it's feeding into this. It's accelerating the gulf that divides, the mistrust, and increasingly moving forward, potentially, the emergence of this multipolar system that everyone is talking about.
Well, so that's a fascinating point, actually. It's worth a clap because it's actually a fascinating point. I mean, the fact is that there is this sense, I think, of greater, let's say, antagonism between, the global north and the global south. And I've had I suppose, the terrible privilege of covering Ukraine and covering Afghanistan and covering, various wars. And it's fair to say that the interest and sympathy you would hear from Western audiences when it came to Ukraine dwarfed whatever you would hear about Lebanon and Gaza. And I think, like there is actually a larger point here, which is that you know, I mean, we as Arabs, and I mean, Palestinians perhaps are the canary in the cave here, but it seems clear that Arabs in general, the view for them is that they are supposed to accept, I guess, whatever crumbs go along. I mean, the word in Arabic is mazra, and my theory here is that basically, your intention is not to keep your cows and sheep in luxury. Your intention is to basically give them as little as possible, while keeping them able to produce enough milk and what have you for you, right? But the intention is not to actually center their rights and give them luxuries, right? Those luxuries seem to be more kept for audiences that are, let's say, whiter perhaps, or that are perhaps, Israel, but certainly not the Arab world. And I guess the reason why I'm asking this, and this is a long preamble for the following, if we are seeing that the policies, you know, from the global north are no longer in line with people's aspirations in the region, right? And the governments, we can agree, are more aligned with the global north or with the governments because, because of linkages, whether that's because of weapons or whatever. Where does that leave us? This, I guess, goes back to Nadim's original point. How can public opinion actually affect public policy? And case in point here is Lebanon. I remember back in, what was it, 2019, when a quarter of the population was on the streets. And I gotta say, nothing happened, right? Gaza, we've heard people shout all the time over the last year. Nothing has happened. We're still in the genocide. We're still in the situation. So what do you think? This is not a very hopeful question, but let's hear. Let's start with Michael again.
I certainly think that these are the changes that you're seeing, and it is, I think, one of the more surprising findings out of the more recently the Arab Barometer is that if we compared who's standing up for the right to human rights and freedom of speech in the Arab world, comparing the U.S. and China, we actually started to see the countries surveyed after October 7th, we're saying China, which is just a case in point, I think, of the loss of credibility. I think, as you're getting at, one of the things that was particularly surprising, or not surprising, but we noted was that the ratings of Russia, the favorability of Russia was often 3 to 4 times higher than its support for its invasion of Ukraine. And so you see that there's just a divorce between the two, that really this is a European conflict that everyone is in the Middle East is supposed to be falling in line with the West. And yet when the war in Gaza happens, that nothing happens. And so it really is coming to this loss of credibility. I think what you are starting to see now as Arab publics are turning, particularly towards China as a response, away from the United States, away from the UK, away from France, those that they saw as being complicit with the war in Gaza, and really looking to an alternative power. And how that shifts public opinion, it's something that certainly makes it easier for leaders to make that shift as well. I mean, certainly Xi Jinping on his way back from his way back to China from a conference stops in Morocco. The first time the Chinese premier has ever visited Morocco. It's a longtime U.S. ally and is warmly welcome there. I mean, it is starting to be something that is, as you're seeing the protests in Morocco, another way that the leaders can potentially come into line with the public is to embrace the foreign powers that they're. It creates an environment that's more open for leaders to be able to make that pivot and make that turn in a way. And so I do think that you're likely to start seeing some of these changes take place with the shift towards China. We haven't seen that as much towards Russia at this point. I think that the legacy of Syria may be an issue there, but certainly it creates an opening for China.
Please, Dr. Amani.
So, building on what Michael said, so I would actually argue that public opinion is extremely important in the context of the Arab world, even though we always see a divergence between Arab public opinion and regime policies across the board. Here's why it's important, and I've written about this extensively, which I will still maintain that there are always external and especially Western attempts always to use Arab public opinion against the interest of Arab people. Let me elaborate.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Let me elaborate. So let's just take Gaza as the most recent example. Uh, what is the justification that often floats in Western media about Gaza? Well, everybody supports Hamas. That's not true, right? Our results, our Arab Barometer data shows that, like any other vibrant political community, there was a robust debate about Hamas governance in Gaza before October 7th. First of all, in fact, about 2/3 of Palestinians in Gaza were distrustful of Hamas government on October till October 6th.
Right, and the West Bank actually has more support.
And the West Bank, we need to look at support for Mahmoud Abbas is even lower than that. So and we see this across many different Arab contexts. But so the idea that every child is fair target in Gaza because somehow, some way, that child supports Hamas or what Hamas did more specifically on October 7th, there's no support in Arab public opinion. And mind you, 50% of Hamas was born after the Hamas election of 2006. So basically, just keeping this all in mind. But the idea is that when it comes to the Arab world, especially sort of like, Muslim and Arab public opinion, the West portrays, and this is where like the Islamophobic undertones always sort of are there, right? Which is that here's this monolithic paintbrush of what the Arab region is, what Palestinians are about, what Gazans are about, what Arab societies are about. And therefore, these policies that are very devastating to the region, right? And it's not just about October 7th, although what's happening in Gaza is horrible. It's let's just be honest. It's been for the last 2, 3, 4 decades. It's been a policy that has brought more wars and destruction to the Middle East than any other region of the world. Since 9/11, there's been consistent wars, civil wars, and destruction in this region. That does not bode well for development, economic development, political development, democratic development. But mind you, there's always been a argument about Arab and Muslim public opinion to quote unquote almost serve as justification for the policies. Going into Iraq, well, everybody supports Saddam Hussein. Everybody wants Saddam Hussein down. Everybody would rather have the US govern Iraq. That was never substantiated, right? Arab societies, how many times we heard the argument, Arab societies are really not ready for democracy because they have to learn to embrace democratic values and democratic norms. So therefore, it's a good thing we have these authoritarian allies who can basically rule their own populations. This is an argument that is still being circulated and is quite popular. And I would argue and maintain this is why we have to be invested in collecting data on Arab citizens and on Arab societies, because otherwise there are discourses out there that want to consistently delegitimate and almost justify why we see so much repression across the region.
Just bouncing off, I think just a couple of quick points. I think the first, fully agree. We have to understand opinion because also it's about agency. I mean, what we're seeing is decades of either the Arab street is portrayed as something that is scary and needs to be controlled. So the foreign policy of Western countries and other countries is to support the dictators because this Arab street scares us. We don't want to understand it. And actually, by the way, dictators use it. Say, you have to give me more of this because otherwise I will unleash the scary Arab street against you. So I think we have to better understand our societies because this is how we get more agency. And that's where accountability starts. The second point I want to make here is what I find striking, to go back to after Gaza, is that it's not just, I mean, we all know since the US invasion of Iraq that I think, and it's been consistent, I think, in the Arab Barometer, that Arab opinions is mostly negative on the US foreign policy, right? I mean, this is not new. But what I find interesting since Gaza is you're having the westernized Arab elites that are turning their back to a certain extent. And that's maybe something that will not come up in a major sample because it represents small percentage in societies. But I think all of us in this room, we know it from our intimate conversations that we are having. And it reminds me of an essay that the Turkish author Orhan Pamuk had written about 2 decades ago about Europe not making him dream again. He doesn't dream about being European anymore at the time he wrote that essay. Beautiful essay. And I think a lot of westernized Arabs, hyphenated Arabs, feel that way today.
Absolutely.
And that's why actually a number of them are moving and working in Qatar, in Dubai, not leaving just, in universities in the Mashriq or the Maghreb. They're also leaving universities in North America and Western Europe for various reasons. And that's interesting. Now, does this mean, a cynical European diplomat told me, where do you think you're going to go? I mean, that shows you a bit the arrogance. You're going to go to China and Russia. You're still sending your kids to universities in the States and Canada and London. And they're true for now. I mean, so I think there's going to be, I guess my point here is there's going to be a bit of a gap between because this is very intimate, how people are processing these sentiments. This is something that affects each and one of us deeply, how we want to position ourselves. And I don't necessarily see it as global north, global south, because many of us, for instance, see allies in global north societies. We find that, it's a bit more complex than that aspect. But there will be perhaps a gap as we make these big choices and how we think about it. And just finally, beware of still waters. Okay, so where is the Arab street? It's true. We did not see the protests in the Arab region that we saw in London, in Western capitals for Gaza. But this is also a region that has come up after a roller coaster. Wars, repression. I mean, a group of activists in Egypt, Egyptian women stood in front of the UN to protest about the situation of Palestinian women in Gaza. They were detained immediately. So the Arab public opinion is not just going to manifest itself in the street, so to speak, and it's actually manifesting itself in private conversation. And one of the interesting things has been how a new generation, today's teens and preteens, their only agency, the way they're expressing their agency is through their consumption patterns. So, for instance, in Jordan, no one is buying Coca-Cola anymore. Now you could tell me it's true; it's not going to change foreign policy, but it's a new generation, a TikTok generation, that is being politicized around Palestine. Today, their politicization is perhaps what we would consider maybe shallow, consumption pattern. But that's where they are at today. We don't know how this politicization will evolve. And I think we need to pay attention. And frankly, I wish, and for me, it's also just an ethical point that let's not talk about Arab Street. Let's not talk about ourselves as these masses, these angry masses. We're individuals. And I worry sometimes, I'll just end because this is something that bothers me a lot. When we talk about victims in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, we always talk about children and women. We never mention men because somehow Arab men are all scary.
Right, screw the
today,
men.
right?
Yeah.
All the men are potential terrorists in waiting, guilty until proven innocent. Why should we accept that? Why should we accept that, they're not, that all we want is to be treated equally? And I think that feeling is very, very powerful. The question is, where are our allies? How we're going to build it internationally, locally, regionally. And I think this is what we need to be focusing on for the future.
Well, so before I go to Tariq, I'm just going to build up on your point. I mean, as a hyphenated Arab man, I can tell you that, I mean, I'm, supremely westernized. I speak English in many ways better than Arabic. I certainly write in English better than I write in Arabic. I can quote pop culture in America like nobody's business. I'm not going to tell you about sort of the latest thing on Shahid. But you are correct in saying that at this point, I mean, I myself feel that I was hoodwinked. Honestly, I feel like I was tricked. You know what I mean? Like I was basically believing the notion that, oh, America is about the notion of merit or about sort of, like equal rights and all that stuff. I feel like a fool, honestly, right? I mean, I don't say this very often. I'm very arrogant, as most people know, but still, like the point remains. I really feel that I was hoodwinked, and that seems to be a common feeling among many of my peers who are, in theory, the sort of, elites. Well, what do you think? Tell us.
Without a doubt, hoodwinked, fooled, thrown under the bus. Um, since Nadim has brought up the class of what you might call Western educated Arabs, they're probably the biggest casualty in the last year. Of course, nothing compares to what people in Gaza are going through. But in terms of a class of people who were attached to certain ideas, values, norms, worldviews, they're completely bankrupt. I've spent the bulk of my life building bridges, hoping to be a part of a world that really is rules based and where Arabs are respected and treated equally as others. I'm walking away from that. Not only do I feel disillusioned and disappointed, I actually don't believe in that anymore. And that is perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this. I no longer believe in a.
Islam tummak, tamaman. It's the way it is.
I'm on a roll today, it seems.
He should be leading it. I'm just,
But underneath that is a lot of pain also, is a lot of disappointment. And I've said this to a lot of my colleagues. Amani and I perhaps go back closest in age. We used the term right before most people came in. We've been in the trenches for a very long time, and we're still standing. But we're also tired. We're exhausted. And we're hoping against hope at a time where increasingly we no longer have answers for major existential questions about life and death, about being a Muslim, being an Arab. We can't talk to our kids anymore. Public opinion and the accumulation of what's happened in the last year is not necessarily going to transpire tomorrow or next week. There is an entire generation, I would say a super majority of Arabs, who grew up with very limited knowledge about the Palestinian question. The last intifada happened before they were born. Many of them grew up in a world where, well, it was the Abraham Accords, the model, or perhaps the approach that was presented to them. And yet, this supermajority of Arabs has had to witness, bear witness, day and night to everything that has happened. They're coming up, they're growing up with a fundamentally different view of the world, of themselves, of others. Where this goes is where I think is an issue we need to be thinking about, worrying about. And I guess my message to people in the West, and here I agree with you, Nadim, maybe the category global North, global South is not always helpful. I used it in the context of the climate change issue. But the category of the West, with everything it presents, values, norms, civilization, etc., is part and parcel of what needs to be dealt with now. And that's what our kids are.
he's on a roll. كمل, come on. شو مالك؟ عم تحكي, احكي. What did I say? No. Well, We have 9 minutes left, and I'm supposed to sort of open this up to questions, and so I will, even though I like to talk. So, who wants to ask? Sorry. Well, I'll start with you over there with the glasses because you're the one who raised your hand first. Should I give you the mic? I'll come give you the mic. Is that okay?
Thank you very much to the panel. I think I'm not the only one in the room who can say that this has been occupying my thinking day and night over the past year. And as a hyphenated Arab myself, I wanted to ask, as we rethink our paradigms and as we rethink the world, I'm finding it difficult to grapple on some sort of theoretical framework, some sort of ideology, some sort of leadership in looking into the future. And I don't know if that's something necessary, but it's something that I personally am looking for to explain the world and to present a new worldview. My question to you is, how do you see that? Do we need that? Do we have the leadership, whether formal or informal, to drive forward a new future for us in the Arab world?
So, is this question for anyone specific?
For all of them, I guess.
Who wants to jump in? Go ahead. Ask. It's a big
I
question.
mean, just trying to interpret your question. So moving forward, this matters in ways that many of us are going to have to deal with. I hinted at what our kids and relatives and friends and colleagues and people who are used to us speaking about sort of certain issues that we've stopped speaking about: democratization, human rights, rules-based. This is going to matter increasingly for things that are happening and changing in the world. I mean, think about the emerging and intensifying competition between the US and China moving forward. What is our position on that? Are we going to be asked to take sides? And if we're not going to take sides, how do we justify that? Increasingly, I would say, those who come from Europe or the US who are trying to enlist us to be on the anti-China bandwagon are not appealing to the things that were fashionable a few years ago, right? Rule of law, human rights, respect for dignity. It's about we're better than China. We will outlast China. Uh, I'm afraid it's not going to work that way. And there's a lot of pushback. There are a lot of suspicion and trepidation and hesitance. And people in the region and in many other parts of the world are choosing not to take sides or not to believe everything that comes to them at face value. I actually happen to think the Gaza war has concretified that thinking, that positioning. So this is going to matter for a lot of practical things and a lot of big things in the world of politics. And we'll see how this over time manifests itself.
Please.
Just really briefly, so just echoing what Tarek said. I think I'm looking forward to advising the next generation of dissertation theses that ask the question of how did the war in Gaza undermine what we consider to be like in the international norms and standards globally. What will the next generation of children, and not just reifying children, but what will the next generation behind us think of international norms? Is there something like an international order, or is that being dismantled? Those are really critical questions. And the truth is, we might want to be asking ourselves also structurally, right? Even, in the context of like the Middle East, are we still invested in international order, even though members of that international order undermined the norms that that international order purportedly upheld?
100%.
Is there still benefit in having an international order that we will champion? Because there is this worry that if there isn't an international order, right, and doesn't, what will happen to the nations of the world? So this is also an opportunity for us to be asking these questions as members of the Middle East states, as well. But there are going to be these fallouts that will emerge because of the Gaza war.
So, Nadim, I'm going to go to
But
the.
just very
Go
briefly
ahead,
on this,
please.
because I think
Go
this is
ahead.
a fascinating question. And for me, we have to realize that Gaza is not just today resonates in the Arab world. It's become a global justice issue. And so I think in a way we're very much located at the heart. What the last question is about is a question I hear from young people across the world. Gramsci is saying the old world has died, but the new world is yet to be born, is resonating across so many people because we see this. So for me, the issue is ما ننزوي. We should not isolate ourselves. We should build tomorrow's world with those who want to build it with us. And they may be in South Africa, and they may be the youth in London today, or in Boston tomorrow, in the university campuses, on American campuses. I actually think this is our moment to engage in the conversation, to lean in, and to find these partners wherever they may be, to build that narrative. Because I think today Gaza resonates in the US because it reminds people of Native Americans' struggle. It resonates with people in Europe for various reasons. It's become a sign of injustice because people see as well that the economic system is deeply unjust. We haven't talked about environmental issues. For me, it's very interesting to see someone like Greta Thunberg, from Fridays for
Right.
who started. Everyone loved her in the West when it was just about the environment. Well, guess where her environmental activism got her? Because she was thinking about environmental justice. She is today standing with Gaza. Suddenly, everyone hates her in the West. Oh, she's scary now. She's no longer this cute girl who's invited to speak at UN General Assembly. But look at her trajectory. We also need to make our trajectory from our own wounds, from Gaza, from Beirut, from Damascus, from Baghdad, to meet them somewhere to say, yes, we're thinking about Gaza, but we're also thinking with you about what is the global order we want to build on the environment, on the economy. And I think we can do it. I actually have a lot of faith in the younger generation. It is a totally globalized, and we should not just be these flyover countries where we don't get a say. And I think this is why public opinion is so important.
Well, so Dr. Michael, I'm going to build on that. So you know why? I mean, I just want to sort of build on that question, and I feel that this is sort of what we're circling around. How permanent are these shifts that we're talking about, right? I mean, okay, I'm angry now at the West, etc. We're hearing our panelists express disappointment and anger. How permanent are these changes and shifts? And I'm wondering if the Arab Barometer has done some work on this.
So this is a great question. I think one of the things that we saw after 2003 with the U.S. invasion of Iraq was this real decline in views towards the U.S. It took a very long time to build that back to even have any hope of having a more positive view towards the U.S. It really, at that point, was reaching a point that there was a more positive view, that the U.S. was now starting to look with 40-50%, much higher than it was before. But certainly the decline. I mean, in Tunisia, in 3 weeks, we saw it drop from 40% to 10%, having support in the days after Gaza. I mean, this was an immediate change. And I think certainly the things that we're seeing here are unlikely to go away. If we ask people, how do you describe this? The most common response is genocide. I mean, once you get to that point and once you get to that level, there's no going back. And I think you certainly also see this with polls in Southeast Asia. I mean, they've shown that actually that Gaza is the number one issue in Southeast Asia, which is not even something that's in international relations. It's something that's not particularly here. This is extending to South Africa, to Brazil, to many other countries, and that solidarity that I think is building over this issue with the reforming of the world, it is going to change the world, and it is something that is going to maintain for some time.
Any more questions? Okay, now we have a lot of questions and we have 30 seconds in theory. I'm not sure how this works, so let me ask. I mean, I should ask someone. Well, I mean, I should do this myself. But anyway, let's go with someone. Sorry, go ahead. Oh, it's fine. I mean, I'm happy to get the mic, but I'm just wondering who to give it to because we don't have many questions left. Well, this gentleman here is in front of us. Sorry, I saw you in the back too. Don't worry. I will, if they let us, I will do this.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to try to make it as quick as possible because 30 seconds. Aren't we, when we say the West, we're being a little bit unfair. I mean, as Arab, Western educated Arab, we always had the distrust in the administration. And the shock for us that was laid bare naked over the last 12 months is the reality that we discovered there are two types of Western civilians. One who actually do not see Arabs as worthy, and another who has a misinformation about the history of the conflict. And what happened over the last 12 to 16 months have actually pushed people to understand, investigate. So we have an opportunity whereby when we say West, we see in Spain standing with Palestine. We see in Ireland. Yes, historically, there are other reasons for people actually standing with the cause. But we see in Western countries, in America, we've seen people who've never been interested in politics coming out and discussing the matter and trying to understand it. So being the optimist, I think we know that the West have never been very fair to Arabs. So Gaza is just the latest. I mean, in Europe, we were hearing that Ukrainian refugees are okay to come to the UK because they're like us. I mean, while blocking the roads for Syrian and and these are the people that you bombed their houses. Ukrainians are coming in as a result of a different conflict, and it's not your responsibility to actually. So we've always known that. I'm very surprised for anyone to think that the West have changed over Gaza. It's always been bare naked. But how can we use this as an opportunity to actually drive that momentum within people, to have an influence on the election results in in Western countries, if one will call them Western countries, to drive our cause rather than just be subject of policies that we've seen over the last 3 or 4 decades.
Well, so I'll push back against you, and then I'll open up to the folks here, if you don't mind. Which is that I mean, you're right that obviously we've had some allies in places you wouldn't expect, but I think the main issue, at least for me anyway, from people, is that we are basically having to justify. I mean, to explain to people that a genocide is happening. It just seems so fatuous as an idea that I have to explain to someone abroad that the people are being killed and destroyed, and I mean I guess the question is that the fact that we have to sort of ask these people to be our allies, the fact that we have to even like sort of wait for them to express some kind of support instead of them jumping for support and saying this is wrong, right? Like when we saw what happened in Ukraine, I mean, I had the terrible privilege of being there from the first day, right? And there was no equivocation. Immediately, you saw people going in and being able to cross from Ukraine into Europe with no problems, right? I again had the privilege of walking with the Syrians from Turkey all the way to Europe, and I saw the obstacles that were there. And my problem with it is, and I must say, this is the issue that sort of drives me crazy, is that it's clear after all the effort that I think people like us have done to be integrated into Western societies, etc. After all that, right, you are still not considered human enough, to get sort of the default level solidarity, right? I don't want to explain that a genocide is happening. A genocide is happening. There's no question of it, right? It is clear, right, at this point. Like, why should we wait for people to sort of, take the time to understand that and let it percolate, right? There are moments of unequivocation that should be there, right? And if they don't, well, I don't know. Then it's a matter of clash of civilizations. Again, I'm not I'm clearly not an optimist, so we differ in that sense. But anyway, please go ahead. One of you. Because we have two more questions, and I was told I have to cut this off. One more question. It's a lie. One more question. Please. One of you.
Just maybe to build on what was said, what you said, and what Mundir said. I agree. Nadim is right. Yes, we should be building a better world, but let us not lose sight of what happened now and move past it, is what I'm saying. And my view is this time it's different. Yeah, we've been thrown under the bus before multiple times. This time it's different. It feels different. It goes to the core of everything that one thinks about. And I'll just cite one example, and forgive me for being very personal again here, Mundir. I recall the moment of 9/11. I drove to class that day. I had a classroom full of 250 students in a US university. I cried in front of students because I felt immensely upset that my beliefs, rooted in my Arabism and Islamism, would be associated with something as horrible as what happened on 9/11. I did this voluntarily. No one asked me. I have received in my office in Doha in the last 12 months delegations upon delegations, individuals upon individuals coming from Western countries, many of them representing governments. Not a single one of them started the conversation by acknowledging what could possibly be the pain that people are going through. This is personal. It's happening now. In fact, there are people who try to pretend there is nothing happening. That is the sense in which we can't just go back to business as usual. We miss the opportunity to fix things. And ultimately, we'll build that order. But I'm not quite ready yet to go back to what I was just a year ago. I'm not.
Well, the last question. We have a lot of people. I guess there are no questions. That was a lie. Yet another lie. Sorry, everyone. Well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you. And please thank our lovely panelists.